Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, earth-shattering discoveries, and magnum opuses and tour de forces from obscure sources mostly. And we've been digging into a lot of New Testament Bible decodes here in the last 6 months, mainly on the tip of the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, the rather obvious psychological operation that the Romans ran against the Jews and whoever else was a believer. The Romans created the Gospels as a fiction in order to mellow out or tame or domesticate or prune or there's one more word, the Jews. Because the Jews had been a big thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years, culminating in the war between the Romans and the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. As a result, two veterans of those wars, Emperor Vespasian and his son, Emperor Titus, who were both wounded in the war, decided to write the Gospels, taking advantage of the zealous and jealous and ritual-obsessed Jews who were waiting for a Messiah to come to help them throw off the Romans, a military leader. And so instead, the Romans proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and turning the other cheek to oppression. And there's a ton of evidence for this, in especially if you read the accompanying work to the Gospels, which is a book called The Jewish War, 7 volumes by Josephus, or Flavius Josephus. Flavius is the name of the dynasty of Caesars that included Vespasian, Titus, and his son Domitian from 69 to 96 AD. And they backdated the story of the Gospels by 40 plus years. And they created a ton of different parallels and patterns and correspondences and typologies and puns and riddles between the Gospels and War of the Jews. So much so that there are over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. The book of Luke is only 1,151 verses long, so there's one every less than 5 verses. And some of them last for several verses, meaning that the entire book of Luke is completely saturated with parallels to the War of the Jews. And some of the parallels are literally stunning in their detail and their mean-spiritedness and their well-hiddenness and just the amount of thought that would have gone into it. Some of them are less so, certainly, but some of them are just devastating. So, and that's not the only set of patterns between the two works. You can also find some patterns in some of the works of some of the other Roman writers other than Josephus, including Suetonius. A lot of his, if you read Suetonius's 12 emperors, especially the part about Domitian, he talks about Domitian's throne room where he lives, and the imagery in his throne room is identical to the imagery in the book of Revelation. Many more parallels. Now, though, we are, we've kind of hashed all that out over the last 150 or so videos, and we are now looking at a related but unrelated book that is called Operation Messiah by Thies Voskelen and Rosemary Sheldon. And this book is basically arguing that Paul, who is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus is, that Paul was actually an intelligent agent for the Romans, and they're going to give the evidence for that. Now, these people are not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis, which was first popularly proffered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, but goes back way before that to people like Abelard Reuchlin, Roman Piso, and even all the way back to Sir Ronald Syme and James Valentine Hannay and Bruno Bauer back over 100 years ago, 150 years ago for Bauer. And you know, it's not a well-known theory, so they're not aware of it. But the evidence that they give is also, I think, a strong argument for the Roman origins hypothesis. They just don't make that last leap. But we went through the preface yesterday, one preface written by each of them. And now we're about to start the introduction. A true portrait of the man we call St. Paul is impossible. With only scraps of information and tendentious accounts, we are left to our own imagination to fill in the gaps. Needless to say, there are gaps in Paul's story big enough to drive through a truck full of Bibles. There are more lacunae than text, more questions than answers, more imponderables than certainties. John Gager is correct when he says, quote, "It will never be possible to meet the real Paul. We will always approach him through images and impressions, some of his friends, some from his friends, some from his enemies." End quote. Indeed, conflicting images of Paul had already emerged in his own lifetime, and he himself was well aware of these contradictory views. He complains in his letters about being misunderstood by his own followers. Paul saw these views of himself as distorted, and in his letters he sought to correct them. He failed, and thus people continued to write about Paul the misogynist, Paul the irascible egotist, Paul the systematic theologian, Paul the homophobe and closet homosexual, and Paul the father of Christian anti-Judaism. So why not Paul the undercover agent? If still another book on Paul must appear, at least let it have an original thesis. A large part of what we say about Paul depends on how we interpret the reliability of the sources that mention him or claim to have originated from him. Paul says nothing about his own life. He also says nothing about Jesus' life, just for the record. But he, with the Roman origins hypothesis, at least according to the vast majority of the people that have proffered the theory, Paul is every bit as fictional as Jesus is. This is all a story that's being written by the Romans. Now, they may be based on actual characters that lived there in the first century, no doubt. And they may be based on what was written in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, Paul says nothing about his own life. Paul's story is known from a small collection purporting to be his letters and written a generation after his death. We will not refer to the author of Acts as Luke. Most scholars believe that Luke wrote the book of Acts as kind of like a sequel to the book of Luke. Although it is true that the book of Acts begins by strongly implying that it is a continuator of the text we refer to as the Gospel of Luke, this is a tenuous connection and it is misleading. For that matter, we do not know who wrote the Gospel attributed to Luke. The best we can say is it may have had the same author, but that author is unknown. But if you find 250 parallels between it and Josephus' War of the Jews, then you can figure out that it was written by Josephus, whoever Josephus was. The only thing that we really know about Josephus is that he emanated from the Roman Caesar's palace at Rome. The accuracy of both has been debated by scholars for well over a century. There are so many contradictions between Paul of the book of Acts and the Paul we know from his own letters, differences in theology, biography, chronology, and geography, that it makes it quite impossible to accept Luke's narratives at face value. Now we're talking about Luke. You just said last paragraph that you weren't going to say that Luke wrote it. Okay, I can understand where he's coming from. It's quite possible to accept Luke's narratives at face value. While Paul's letters cannot take us as close to the historical origins of the Jesus movement as we would like, wish, or expect, his letters do come from someone who was acquainted with the leaders of the original Nazarene community. Not by much, I suppose, as long as he's not talking about Peter and John and James. The possible relationship between Paul's letters and the four Gospels has also long been a topic of indecisive debate. Scholarly interpretation of these texts has ranged from the extremely pious to the hypercritical. In the first group would be those who accept at face value the Gospels, all of Paul's letters, and every word of the book of Acts, which recounts the development of Christianity from Jesus' resurrection to Paul's incarceration in Rome at the end of his career. In the later category would be the radical Dutch school of biblical criticism that believes all the letters are of a much later date and did not originate with Paul. I would concur. According to at least Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, the epistles of Paul were written primarily by Pliny the Younger in a much later date of between 100 and 110 AD. Pliny himself writes a number of epistles, but they figured out that it was Pliny the Younger because of his correspondence, his letters, private letters that were somewhat public, that he wrote to other Roman royals. Pliny was, a candidate for emperor. He never became emperor, but he was a denizen of the Roman court there. And he wrote a lot of letters to Emperor Trajan, and let's see, who is he also writing to? Tacitus. Okay, so they kind of read all the letters that Pliny wrote and figured out all of the kind of the aliases that he used by kind of connecting the aliases with the location that he was at a certain time or a certain place. So that's how, so they basically figured it out, not really with a historical method, but more like a detective method. And it's interesting to note that both of them basically figured it out independently. Okay, how one dates such documents and values their authenticity will obviously influence one's interpretation of the Paul we meet in them. In this work, we can throw the net out widely to include the New Testament Apocrypha, books that didn't make it into the New Testament, like the Acts of Paul, the Gospel of Peter, later Christian works by Tertullian, Eusebius, the Testimony of the Ebionites, the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies, the Apostolic Constitutions. We also must take into consideration Jewish sources like Josephus. Now, Josephus was originally a Jew. When he surrendered to Vespasian, he said that he now believes that God favors the Romans and not the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans. He predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor, and when he did, Emperor Vespasian pardoned him and brought him to Rome as one of the court historians, put him up at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. So he's known as Flavius Josephus, from the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. So take into consideration Jewish sources like Josephus and Philo. And Philo was a little bit earlier period, but he's also in on the whole game. I believe it's his nephew, Tiberius Alexander, was a very big booster of Vespasian at the time of the Roman Civil War, when, the emperorship was basically up for grabs for a couple years after the I guess forced suicide of Nero in 68 AD. Paul influenced the heretical teachings of Marcion as gleaned from Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and the Jewish writer Celsus, who knew of Marcion and used his writings to argue against Christianity. Finally, there are the Gnostic writings. None of these sources are considered uncritically, but read in their context, our job is the detection of bias or tendencies. Why do many New Testament scholars agree that Acts is legendary and fictitious in large measure, and then go right on accepting the story at face value? All of these sources, the New Testament and all the rest, are religious documents, not a compendium of dispassionate historical information. Each must be treated with great reserve, yet mined for the occasional vital bit of information. You're here. Another topic we will bring up is the use of terms that give a false continuity of events or a sense of homogenization to groups that were not in agreement. It has been suggested, for example, that we should speak of multiple Judaisms during the Second Temple period and not lump all Jewish religious groups together. We will not use the term Rabbinic Judaism for anything before the 2nd century CE. The same might be said of multiple Christianities, since there were many groups in the first 2 centuries that considered themselves Christians, but were not in agreement as to doctrine or practice. The recent publication of the Gospel of Judas is only one example. Judeo-Christianity is another such term that suggests there was a clear, smooth transition. There was not. Scholars often want to judge the authenticity and importance of an early practice according to how it fits into the seemingly inevitable progress toward the form of Christianity that triumphed. But in this case, the historical prevalence of some sources does not mean that they are more historically reliable than those sources that did not end up in the Bible. The people who selected the texts that were included in the Bible picked these based on their religious orthodoxy, not their historical credibility. We must also look at the evidence from those groups that did not survive. The term Jewish Christian is an anachronism, as is the Jerusalem church. We will use neither. Two sets of Yahweh worshiping groups survived and adopted swiftly after 70 CE. The destruction of the temple, or destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Those who eventually formed Rabbinic Judaism, common antecedent of almost all branches of modern Judaism, and Christianity, whose Gospels were written in the last decades of the first century. Now that is exactly the Roman origins hypothesis. Two sets of Yahweh worshiping groups survived and adopted swiftly after 70 CE, right after the war, or really after the war continued for a few more years, but the main blow was the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's what, Jesus predicted in the New Testament, and it was fulfilled to the letter by Titus. So Titus is grafting himself onto the Jewish tradition by making himself the second coming of Jesus. And he says those who eventually formed Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, whose Gospels were written in the last decades of the first century. So both of these groups, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, they both have almost identical origination stories, in that the founder of Rabbinic Judaism's name was Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he also, just like Josephus, he also surrendered to Vespasian and prophesied that Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian became emperor, he hooked up Ben Zakkai with a campus, a land grant, to start a camp, like a college of study of the Torah and the other Jewish scriptures. And so it was kind of another psychological operation, exactly the same as Christianity, but it was toward a different group of Jews, the Pharisees, as opposed to kind of the more zealous Jews that were in the Christian camp. I won't say zealous, maybe pious, or but they did exactly the same thing. They started this Rabbinic Judaism to get the Jews distracted into the minutia of the texts, like, just breaking down the text and looking for details, as opposed to revolting and revoluting and uprising and rioting, which is what the Jews had been doing constantly for the last 130 years before then. So that this was another attempt by the Romans to pacify the Jews. So both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. So we can see that there's a very clear MO there. This is their method of operation. The Romans created a number of other religions as well in the first century for psychological purposes. We should not use Jewish or Christian to describe pre-70 groups, because doing so presupposes a false continuity. Roman observers themselves do not use the word Christianity until the 2nd century CE. The followers of Jesus were not conscious of themselves as Christians. They called themselves Nazarenes. And this shows the falseness of a lot of Christians will trump up the persecution of Christians by the Romans in the first century. And I would argue that it was practically non-existent, that the persecution was of Jews, not Christians. Like he says, they were not conscious of themselves as Christians. And so the Romans aren't going to be conscious of them as Christians either. And since the Romans are creating a psychological operation, they're going to favor the Christians, as Paul's story will describe. They're going to favor the Christians, not put them to death, feed them to the lions. They're going to feed the Jews to the lions, and that's what they did. So using the old familiar theological and Christian terms has a narcotic effect that makes us think we know more than we do. This is the next section. It's called Clandestine Paths. P-A-T-H-S. Paul never knew Jesus. These two men never met once. The disciples who knew Jesus best, such as Peter, James, and John, have left no writings behind them explaining how Jesus seemed to them or what they considered his mission to have been. Nor have they, now just for the record, that like the books of James have been declared forgeries by scholars at least. John, written by a different John, and Peter was basically, supposed to have been the muse for the book of Mark. He was Mark's informant, according to scholars. According to what I know of what scholars, they may have changed their mind by now, but that's how I learned it. So how Jesus seemed to them, or what they considered his mission to have been. Nor have they commented on Paul. Each modern commentator has filled in the story with his or her own experience and knowledge, and they often write of Paul as they wish to see him. There has been speculation about his thoughts, his acts, his beliefs, his convictions, his appearance, his health, and his sexual orientation. There is a kaleidoscope of images of Paul, and the elements are being constantly recombined. The entire corpus of Pauline scholarship has far outstripped the number of readers and time available to sift through it all. The best we can do is assess the ancient evidence and see where it leads. The road seems to go down some interesting clandestine paths. The Apostle Paul is, next to Jesus, the most intriguing figure in first century Christianity. But Paul has always, I guess, I'm not convinced of that statement, but we'll keep going. I can think about Josephus and Pliny the Younger and Arius Piso and even Seneca the Younger. But anyway, I guess Paul is intriguing. The most intriguing figure in first century Christianity. But Paul has also always been an uncomfortable and controversial figure, especially in his own time. He has been compared to King Ahab, whom the prophet Elijah dubbed the troubler of Israel. One of the chief reasons we have the documents referred to as his letters is that his teachings, themselves a challenge to existing beliefs about God and Jesus, were quickly opposed from both within and without the religious communities he established. Answers and a defense had to be given, whether by him or later writers. Paul first appeared on the public stage as a persecutor, trying to violently destroy the embryonic movement within the Second Temple Judaism called the sect of the Nazarenes. And you can see that in Acts 24:5, Acts 14, 28. Paul claimed he got his interpretation from the resurrected Jesus himself. And he claimed this was actually superior to acquaintance with Jesus during his lifetime. His sudden appearance, claim to authority, and zealous commitment to his new religion created tremendous resentment among his fellow Jews, including those Jews who had come to believe in Jesus as Israel's Messiah. It should be noted that the concept of the Messiah as we know it was not the prevalent definition of the Messiah in Paul's time. The common definition was that of a political king, appointed and installed by God to rule as king of the Jews, not a spiritual leader who would return after a crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, but a man who would be rightly anointed king in his own lifetime. And yet, I think there's a military component there as well, especially given that the Jews were under colonization for many of those centuries, that some of these prophecies came down from the Old Testament, which, isn't an entity either from the Jewish scriptures. And yet, within 2 generations, the Jesus movement becomes Christianity, separated from the Jewish religion, and preaching about a resurrected God and a pacifist approach to the Roman occupation. We believe the new message was introduced by the persecutor Paul under his Roman name, the persecutor Saul under his Roman name Paul. It had nothing to do with a religious experience. How did this happen? Who agreed with Paul's message and activities? And who saw this newcomer weaving an entirely new story about Jesus and getting it all wrong? Paul remained a controversial figure in the generations that immediately followed his own. The pastoral epistles, which include 1st and 2nd Timothy and also Titus, are accepted by most scholars as having been written after Paul's lifetime, because although they are written from within the tradition that Paul inaugurated, they seem to present a softer, somewhat idealized Paul, more amenable to the faith forms and structure of mainstream Christianity as it emerged from the 1st century. Even the Paul of Acts seems to have been stripped of much